Hi, I'm Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Well, last night, Kamala Harris gave her acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention. She's now the Democratic Party's nominee for president. And in her speech, she criticized Donald Trump for having, quote, handpicked members of the United States Supreme Court to take away reproductive freedom. And of course, what she's talking about there was that Trump had appointed three members, conservative members, to the Supreme Court, and that the court then went ahead and reversed Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision. And then a little bit later on in her speech, Harris went on to say, and when Congress passes a bill to restore reproductive freedom, as President of the United States, I will proudly sign it into law. So what she's talking about there is that if the Democrats were able to get control of both houses of Congress, conceivably they could pass a federal law that would make abortion legal throughout the entire country. And she in turn has said that she would very, very gladly sign that into law. And of course, the background behind the whole thing, of course, is the original Roe versus Wade case back in 1973. What happened was that Roe v. Wade, part of the reason why I think that the Supreme Court undid Roe v. Wade was because it had a really bizarre legal reasoning. Basically, there were two questions that came before the court in Roe. One of them, of course, is whether or not a woman has a right to privacy that would include the right to have an abortion. Then the other question, of course, would be, is the unborn child a human person with a right to life that's protected by the due process and equal protection clauses of the Constitution? And what happened was that in addressing these two questions, the court took two totally opposite and opposed approaches to the Constitution. On the first one, they took a very, very broad, sweeping one. They had to acknowledge, of course, that nowhere is the word abortion mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. So how then did they conclude that somehow or other a woman has a constitutional right to have an abortion? Well, the argument was that it's based on the right to privacy, and they argued that the right to privacy is inferred. Of course, they were going by an earlier case that involved birth control. And so they concluded from that the Constitution guarantees a right to privacy, which they then argued would then include the right to have an abortion. Now, on the other question, does the child have the unborn child have a right to life? On that one, they took the exact opposite approach to the Constitution. What they did there was they took a very, very narrow legal approach. They looked at all the different places where the word person is used in the Constitution, and then pointed out that it only applied to people who were basically grown adults. And so therefore they concluded that an unborn child is not a person, at least not a legal person, and therefore not entitled to a right to life. So, and then of course so they had, my argument would be then, is that if the court had decided Roe v. Wade correctly, or even the Dobbs decision more recently overturning Roe, they would have concluded that an unborn child is a human person with a right to life that's protected by the due process and equal protection clauses of the 5th and the 14th Amendments, and therefore abortion should be illegal all across the entire country. Now, when you go back and just take a look at the Constitution, it could be argued that there actually is a right to privacy that would be one of these so-called unenumerated rights that are referred to in the 9th Amendment, and that it would be a right that was retained by the people. But as the court pointed out in the Dobbs decision, in order for there to be a right that's retained by the people, then the people had to have had that right before the Constitution was formulated. There's got to be some kind of a legal precedent for it. And the fact of the matter is, there was no legal precedent for an abortion. And even if there is a right to privacy, that right would not include the right to harm someone else. And what Vice President Harris is arguing, in effect, is it includes the right to take an innocent human life. So then that raises a very, very important question. So what exactly is a human life, a human being? When does human life begin? Well, what happened was that back in the old days, in fact, at the time that the Constitution was framed, the idea was that the child became a living human being at the point in the pregnancy called quickening. That would be the quickening, of course, is being used in the old-fashioned sense of being made alive. And so the theory was that that would be the point at which the mother could begin to feel the baby move inside her womb. At that point, it was pretty obvious there's a live human being inside there, and it would be wrong to terminate the pregnancy at that point. What happened in the 19th century, however, was that modern science and genetics came to a better understanding of how the process of gestation works, and they realized that the fetus undergoes a continuous process of development from the moment of conception right up to the point in which the kid's old enough to play in a high school basketball team. There's no logical point in between at which this fetus or child, infant, suddenly becomes a human being. And so therefore what happened was that the states basically amended their laws to outlaw abortion from the moment of conception. And that was the background for Roe v. Wade. But what does the Bible have to say? But then the question is, okay, but what really is a human being? And I think that what makes the question especially problematical from a modern standpoint is that our modern culture has become so secularized, and a lot of it's based on the idea of the theory of evolution. Supposedly the idea is that as human beings we simply evolved from lower forms of life, and we're basically a form of animals. But if you take a look at the creation account in Genesis, you get a whole different picture of that. In Genesis chapter 1, and reading from the New King James Version, starting in verse 26, it says, "Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. To fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves in the earth." Now, there's several interesting things about this passage that you need to take into note. First of all, it begins off by saying, "Then God said, Let us make man in our image." So the idea there is that the idea for the existence of a human being began before there actually was a real human being. And the reason why I say that is because that would mean then that there's a human essence that defines us as human beings that existed before we actually came into existence. Okay, essence precedes existence, which is the exact opposite of what modern atheistic existentialists have tried to argue. And basically what God said here is, let's make man in our image. So in other words, that human beings are going to be different from animals, that we're going to bear a special resemblance to God himself. So then you ask yourself, well, so what exactly is that? Well, what it says here is, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So what he said now is these human beings that God is going to create, we're going to have dominion over the animal world and the rest of the earth. And what that implies is that human beings were endowed by God with a mind, an intellect, and a will, so that we can think, we can reason, we can make intelligent decisions, we can plan and organize things, and we can manage them, or to have dominion over them. So the idea here is that we are not animals. Human beings are fundamentally different from animals, okay? When I take a look at my daughter's horse out here in the pasture, I could tell there's something fundamentally different about me from the horse, okay? I can think and reason. The horse, can graze around and look for grass to eat, but it can't make the kinds of decisions that I can make and that I can do. So human beings are special. We're different from animals, and we are created in the image of God. We bear a likeness to Him, and that's what makes us different. But then you ask the question, okay, so if we grant that human beings are not animals, that we're different from animals, what then makes human life sacred? Why is it wrong to kill a human being? Well, you go over to chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9, and after the flood, God says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." So in other words, because we bear the image of God, to kill a human being is basically to desecrate the image of God. It's basically an act of sacrilege. So then, basically, the basic moral principle, then, of course, underlying all of this is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And interestingly, Vice President Harris actually said something to that effect in her speech, that that we should practice the golden rule. But for some reason or other, she just simply excluded from her conclusion the fact that the child inside the womb is a human being who deserves the same kind of consideration. And certainly, a mother's love for her infant child is the most basic, fundamental kind of love that there is. And if there's anything, and on the other hand, if we argue from let's say, a modern secular standpoint, that there is nothing sacred about human life, then what is the logical conclusion? Where would it all end? Euthanasia, assisted suicide, infanticide? How about genocide? If there's nothing wrong, if there's nothing sacred about human life, what is wrong with killing a human being? You see, that's the thing that we're facing with. But this country was founded on the principle, as it states in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the question I would put out there to everyone is, do you really want to live in a world in which human life means nothing? Think about it. And thanks for listening, and we hope that we tune in again soon. Bye.